Hi guys, and welcome back to another IBRACORP video. And again, today we're with the awesome open source man himself, Brian, the open source advocate, and continuing our setup with setting up an IT business using all our open source products and services. I'll let Brian go ahead and introduce himself as well.
Hey, it's your open source advocate, and yes, we are back and we kind of a basics setup, start to finish. So that was one of the requests you guys has is really start from scratch and go from that point forward. So we've both covered Proxmox in the past, but we're going to go through the Proxmox install today and just kind of let you guys really start from the beginning with this series and see how everything functions and how everything works. So this is really starting from scratch. If you don't have the hardware yet, that would really be the starting point. But so thanks for all the suggestions. It was just amazing to see all those things. I know you were kind of looking through them earlier. I mean, you feel good about the business we picked here?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a lot of suggestions from the community, which we really appreciate. And obviously, I think for most of our community, people watching our videos, we come back to a bit of an IT space. So we're going to go ahead with that in mind. But just keep in mind that a lot of the tools that we're showing, it doesn't really matter. You can adapt it to whatever you need. We're just giving you an example of using those tools in that space. But again, you can change them and chop it and change it any way you want. Use it the way that suits the business you're going for. For example, if you're going to do remote support, it's not going to matter what job it is. The tool itself will still help you. So really just apply it to whatever situation you're in, and I think that'll be fine.
Again, for the most part, everything we're going to cover, you should be able to use in most businesses that would at least be working in the tech industry. Now, if you're going into something like finance or if you're going into something like medical, we may not cover everything that you're going to want or everything that you're going to need, but you can make requests on the side, and we could always do those as side project videos to kind of help you out as well. So we're always looking for other ideas. But for this one, I think we're going to stick with basically tech consulting is going to be kind of the generalized business that we're starting, and we're really going to start from the ground up. I'm kind of excited about this because thinking through the process of what do we have to do in order to not only have the right hardware and software, but really kind of building out a business. So what other support software is there that you need both internally, externally, everything that goes into it. So I'm really excited about this, ready to get this going.
Absolutely. Well, with that said, we're going to get stuck into it. And the first episode today is going to be covering our base setup, which is going to be Proxmox for virtualization. Should be worth noting there's plenty of virtualization options out there. You can try all sorts of different things. Whatever you're comfortable with at the end of the day, go with that. We're comfortable with Proxmox. It's free and open source. And of course, it's also got enterprise grade level redundancy and features and things like that if you wanted to go down that route further down the line. Now, initially, you're not going to need to worry about any of that stuff. We're going to be looking at basic virtualization here. But going with a good decision at the start means you'll be setting yourself up for success later. And being able to have those features later without having to redo all your servers is going to be a big plus. So we're going to start with Proxmox. Brian, you ready to get started?
I'm ready. Let's get into it.
All right, let's get into it. So we've got the ISO, we've got that directly from the Proxmox website. You guys can do the same. Now, depending how you want to go about it, you can get the ISO onto a USB drive. You can use something like Rufus to make it bootable. Alternative, you can use a tool like Ventoy as well, which lets you just put the ISOs on a USB and it makes it all bootable for you when you start up the new server that you've got ready to go. Now, we could talk about hardware really briefly. You're not going to need anything too crazy, depending on what you're going to be doing, of course. If we're just talking about web services and getting things online, you can look at the hardware in our videos for the TrueNAS series we covered. Alternatively, you can also look at some other options. You don't need too much, just enough storage to get some VMs going, possibly a terabyte, a decent CPU, of course, and a fair bit of RAM. RAM's probably really important when it comes to virtualization because you're going to be spinning up a lot of servers and they can chew up resources if you don't have enough very quickly. Here we are on the installation screen for Proxmox. So let's go ahead and start with that. Next step, accept the agreement. If you accept it, I agree. And then it's going to ask you for the disk you want to use to install Proxmox onto. And we've got our one disk here, so we're going to go ahead with that one.
I just want to say that for Proxmox, it is much easier if you plan out the storage hardware that you want to have ahead of time and already have it installed in your system versus trying to add storage later. If you're just going
Absolutely.
to test it out to see if you like it, definitely go and do that. But be ready to reinstall and then have all of the storage hardware you want in place, because it does, Proxmox just picks up on that during the installation process. But if you try to add storage afterwards, you have to kind of go what we'll call the Linux nerd route, and you have to get in. You have to partition the drives through the terminal, and then mount the drives to the terminal and set things up in your FS tab, and so on and so forth, to really get those things to show up in the Proxmox interface so that you can get those things. So just a suggestion to make sure you've got your storage ready before you really kind of go through this the way we are right now. We're doing this just so you can see the process of getting everything installed and set up.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. That's a really good point, Brian. And it can be really annoying, especially if you're not that experienced with it later down the track. So just have it ready to go right from the start. You have other options there depending on the file system you might want to use. Now that might be getting a little too far into it, but you've got XFS, ext4, and a whole bunch of other ones as well. If you're just starting off and you want to get into it, you can leave it as ext4 or pick XFS. That would be my recommendations.
I think I'd say any of them that support snapshots is probably your best bet, because that lets you do snapshots down the road to your other disks. Now, setting those disks up to be, you can set up all your different disks to be partitioned and formatted in different ways too. So depending on how many different drives you have for your storage, it may not matter what you do with the boot drive, but yeah, ext4 or XFS for the boot drive should be fine.
Now the next one, I don't think we need to tell you guys, but just pick all the details that match your setup, where you are in the world, how you want things to work. You've got your keyboard, for example, and your region. Then it'll ask you to create a password and put in your email address. Once you've done that, go ahead and click next.
Yeah, so on this one, if you're just going to run this as a local server, I wouldn't worry too much about the FQDN having to be anything special, but you just want to give this basically a name. So for me, I gave my system just a name. It doesn't have a full FQDN on my network other than what my network assigns it. So in my case, it's aria.mcg local. I don't use local just because that's kind of a Microsoft reserved type naming structure. But
Yep.
yeah, you could use anything you want. Definitely, feel free to give that a name that's memorable, something you can find on your network. And then on the IP address, put in what you want to assign it if you have something specific. Otherwise, you can let DHCP handle it, and then that will get set, and you can actually set this to be static afterwards. And then the same thing with your gateway information. That's just your router, your gateway to the internet. You want to make sure that that's set correctly. It should auto detect it. If it doesn't, you can go ahead and set that. And then DNS, if you want to use different DNS servers, you can change. Usually the gateway is what you're going to want to use.
Correct, yeah. So just pick whatever suits you guys and your setup at home or your business, wherever you're setting this up. The IP address, mind you, this did get pulled through from DHCP. So if you're happy with what it already picked up, you can just go ahead with that. I'm just going to go ahead with that. You get your summary here, basically, of everything we've just put in. If you're happy with all that, now it's time to get the installation started. So we'll pretty much just wait for that, and we'll come back to you guys once it's finished. All right, guys, and the installation is now finished. As you can see, it's basically rebooted itself and it started up on the terminal screen. And now at this point, you can pretty much walk away from the machine, go onto whatever your workstation is, head to the IP address that you see here, and it'll take you to the interface. If you don't see this screen, obviously you might need to do some troubleshooting, but this should be hopefully where you're at, and you can continue with us to the next step. All right, guys, so we've put in the IP address and the port, and it's taken us to our interface. Now, it's going to ask you to sign in. Obviously, this is the sign in, the password that we used when we went through the installation wizard, and the username is root. Now, something you guys might notice is my theme will look a lot different to yours. I did run a theme. It's called the Discord Dark Theme for Proxmox. We'll drop a link down in the description for you guys if you're interested. You'll also notice that this is my actual live system, so there is a whole bunch of stuff in here, but you can ignore all that. You basically have nothing in here, and that's okay. We're just going to be starting fresh anyway, so just ignore all these virtual machines and containers. We'll be showing you how to set all that up in due time. So where do you think we should start, Brian?
I think actually starting there at the top level that you've got it, and kind of looking over at that next menu to the right, just kind of going through those things there to kind of show everybody what's there, because really, Proxmox can be clustered with multiple servers. If you want to do that, you can also just control multiple servers from a single server interface by hooking them together. So that kind of that top level is really like my cluster, and then the next one down is really your server, and so on. So kind of looking at that first setting where you've got like your storage and your backups and stuff like that at that level, I think is probably a good thing to go through just briefly.
Yep, no worries. So let's look at the file flow here. The first thing you'll notice is we have data center. and then we have PVE. Now PVE is the name of this server that we've set up, which is also known as a node. So as Brian was saying, we can have several nodes. We could have 2 other servers in the same business or house, or even remote, and you can configure them to be more redundant with each other. So starting at the data center level up here, this essentially is our data center. Let's think of this house or business as our data center, and we have maybe one server, we call that PVE. Maybe we set up another server called PVE2. There would be 2 nodes under this data center. So the settings at the top are probably going to be one of the most important for you to go through at the start. And if we just scroll through, we can put notes in. Here's our clustering. This is a very detailed subject, which we're not going to be going through just at the moment. So don't worry about that too much, but here's all the options for clustering when you get to it. So let's go to options. And now here's some of the options that you do probably want to have a look over and just make sure they're correct. We've got our keyboard layout. We picked most of this in our setup anyway, but this is what mine looks like, and I pretty much haven't touched any of this, so shouldn't really need to unless you have a need to. The next part is the storage. Now this is an important one. This allows you to add storage from any sort of resource. If you have, for example, an SMB share, we can set that up here. This is something we covered in our TrueNAS series as well. So you can attach SMB shares, you can attach local storage. Now these should already be here for you, local and local LVM. That's basically the local storage of Proxmox. And then I have created different shares in my TrueNAS server, which is handling all storage. So that's all you're seeing there. You can ignore those. You don't need to have them. And here's our Proxmox backup server, and then there's TrueNAS. So basically, in your scenario, you should have only these 2 visible, and that's all right, unless you want to add any more. If you do have another storage service, maybe you have a cloud server that you have storage on or anything like that, just go ahead and add it. And you can add all the different types of storage as well. So if you had SMB, you would be able to add it that way. In the same screen, you can also configure backups, which we'll get to shortly. So let's go to backups now. And here's our backup option. One of the best parts about Proxmox, in my opinion, is the backups and the snapshots. It's very easy to set up and manage, which is really, really important, especially if we're talking about setting up business infrastructure. Did you have anything you want to talk about backups, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on backups and snapshots. So snapshots are an amazing piece of Proxmox, and they're really great. The thing you have to remember is that snapshots are kind of like a picture in time. And if anything happens to the system, your snapshots are super useful to bring things back to the way they were at a point in time. So think of it kind of like Windows restore point, that kind of thing. Whereas a backup is like, I'm taking a full image of this thing, and I want to store it not only here, but I want to store it on other media and in other locations if at all possible. So kind of keep that in mind when you think backups versus snapshots. You know, snapshots are great for like, I just need to jump back to a point in time where something wasn't messed up because I was tinkering or something like that. And backups are really like, hey, I've got the whole system here, and I do this on a regular basis, and I have it in multiple places just in case anything catastrophic happens. But yeah, the backup capabilities here with Proxmox are awesome. And again, I think it'd be worth, maybe we'll do this in another video, but setting up like TrueNAS or Rockstor or OMV6 or something like that, and then setting up like an NFS share and really just, showing them how to get the backup set up to those remote systems so that, again, if you're setting up a business, these should be things that you plan for. The hardware that it's going to take to do it, if you don't have it just laying around, what the cost would be. And then backup hardware is basically double that storage cost, if not triple it, to make sure you've got plenty of room for more than one backup, things like that. So yeah, definitely something that's really important in the system, and something that I'm sure we'll be covering a lot more on.
Definitely, yeah. It's really good points you've made there. I mean, if we're going to be going through all the effort to set all this up, we really need to be thinking about our data retention, backups. How do we restore business as quickly and as efficiently as possible if things go haywire? Because that could be essentially money out of your pocket if it does become a successful business. So stuff that we'll definitely go over. I think we'll come back to that subject as well. Now, just briefly going over the remaining settings, there shouldn't be too much we need to fiddle around with, but we've got replication here, something we'll cover again when we have at least 2 nodes. Then we have permissions if you want to create users. We can also set up 2-factor authentication, which is great. Groups and pools. We also have roles, so here's all the different roles that are built in. The next thing you have down here is your ACME certificates, so we can get SSL certificates generated for us. We then have a firewall. Now the firewall is pretty interesting in Proxmox. It actually works on multiple layers. So we have a firewall on the data center layer. We then have a firewall on the node layer. And then you have the firewall on every single virtual machine or Linux container underneath that. If you guys do look into the firewall, it's really important that you look at it from the top level down. And just be careful not to enable it until you've put in exceptions for things you want to be able to access. So for example, this is obviously the top layer. We're looking at data center. Go to security group. This is the rule that says, I want you to accept any request on port 8006. So when we enable this, we want to be able to reach Proxmox. Otherwise, the firewall will actually prevent us from being able to access it as well. And we can get into more detail about layering and all that. But I mean, just for basics, set up a security group. You can see we've opened up certain ports and things like that. And then you enable the firewall at the end. The next level is the node, and as you can see, most of the options are pretty similar. I think you guys can work out most of them on your own, but the one thing I'll recommend that you definitely change right after an installation is your updates and repositories. So if we go to our repositories over here, you'll see that the no subscription repository is currently unchecked, and I have the enterprise one checked. But in your case, you'll have it ticked, and it'll say that you don't have a subscription active. So what you want to do is uncheck that, select it, disable, go ahead, highlight the free no subscription option and enable that. Once you've gone ahead and done that, you can then go to the update section and click on refresh.
And I would say, even if this is going to be a production server, I would caution against turning on the no subscription updates. The more frequent updates, just because you don't want something to break your server. You do get updates when you're on the enterprise, when you have the enterprise ticked, but you don't have a subscription, but it's security updates. It's things where they know, like, hey, we need to push this out because it's a security fix for what you have.
Yep.
So they're not going to be super frequent, but you do get them. And then, of course, when there's major release updates, they'll tell you, hey, there's a major release update. I would say on major releases, unless you're super comfortable with doing it, wait for people like us or other YouTube creators who come out with, like, here's your step-by-step guide on how to do this, because they've probably set up a Proxmox server on an old version and then run through that multiple times to make sure they understand the steps. And if you want to watch that, great. If you want to go check out the documentation, same concept. I'd say, be careful with your updates, just because, again, if it's a production server, you don't want to have that thing go bad in the middle of anything like that. So yeah, just a thought there on those kind of different repositories. I've been using the repository up above that above the enterprise area, that no subscription repository, and I've had no issue at all so far. And I've been using it for about a year, but again, it's always a risk. Just kind of know that. So it's not a production system I use it on. It's my test one. The other one, I don't have that turned on. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely wanted to clear that up with you guys. It's a really important one to sort of demystify, because it can be a little confusing at first. Then under the node settings, you have the firewall. Like I said, we won't go through that again, but you basically just add whatever you've added on the data center level. And then you have your disks. Now, if you've set everything up already from the start, you shouldn't need to do anything in here just yet. You can just leave it as is. If you wanted to and you know what you're doing, go ahead. But otherwise, I would suggest just leaving that for the moment. Next part is the Ceph. Again, we'll come back to that in future, replication and subscription. So that is setting up the node and the data center in Proxmox. Now that basically gives us a canvas for us to create our virtual machines or Linux containers. What do you reckon, Brian? Where should we go next?
I mean, why don't we do a Ubuntu VM? I mean, that's kind of where I'm going to start, and I'm going to create a Ubuntu VM that's going to be just set up for doing Docker hosting. That way I can, I'll have a place where I can go set up any applications that we're going to want to run. I'll be able to set them up in Docker, basically, if they're Dockerable, at least. So we could do it as a VM, or we could do it as an LXC container. It's kind of up to you.
Look, we've covered both, and I think both options for you guys would be really interesting. So why don't we quickly just show you how to do both, and we'll pick one that we'll stay with for our installation. So first things first, let's go with an LXC container, and I'll show you what that is. Now, basically, without having to go into too much detail, a virtual machine is, like the name suggests, a whole virtual machine running on the hypervisor, which is Proxmox. The LXC container is actually using all the resources directly off the server, but then virtualizing the operating system. If my understanding is correct, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
That is correct.
So instead of passing through virtualized hardware and resources to a virtual machine, it actually shares everything with the kernel and the host, which is obviously a lot faster. Now, if you guys ever see this, we'll cover this in an upcoming video as well, but the LXC container, you can basically restart it in less than 10 seconds. It's really phenomenal. So let's say we wanted to start up a LXC container first. You'll see we're in our node. We'll right click and go to create CT. It's also in the top here as well if you want to do it that way. But let's click on create CT. We give it an ID, let's say 600. The host name, we'll just call that test LXC, just because I have such a creative mind. The ID will say 650, that's a valid number, and create a password. Also confirm that password as well. Can also use
it. Definitely make this a strong password.
Yeah.
You know, for us, when we're doing these for you guys, we make them whatever we make them, but make it a strong password because this is going to be your root level password for your container.
Absolutely, yeah. Please make it secure. You can also use SSH public keys if you want to use those as well. Another important aspect of the containers is there is a lot of, how do I put this, permission layers and restrictions in place to try and protect your system because it's going to be sharing the kernel and it's going to be sharing resources directly from the host. There are some protections in place. Now, if you want to bypass those, it's pretty easy. If you don't bypass them, it might be tricky later when you're trying to do a couple of things and it might, you might have to change some settings later. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to show you guys a privileged container so it has full access to whatever it needs to do, but you don't have to do it that way. But let's just go ahead and I'll show you what that means. So currently the option unprivileged container is checked. Very confusing wording. Basically it's asking, is it an unprivileged container? And we're saying yes. I'm going to uncheck that. So we're saying we want it to be a privileged container. We'll then go next and it's going to ask you for your storage and for a template. Now you won't have any templates in there at first. So I think if we just go to local and we go to CT templates, you can choose to upload or download one from a URL, or you can pick from the templates. Thankfully, that's already built into Proxmox. So if we click on templates here, you see a whole bunch of different templates that you can spin up in seconds. You've got Turnkey, Open LDAP, for example. You've got Turnkey, Invoice Ninja. I mean, it's pretty cool. Yep. And like I said, this is running directly with the host, so it's going to be fast. It's going to be powerful. But let's go up to the top. We've got Ubuntu here. Pick the one that suits you. I would recommend 20.04. It's the stable release, and it's probably going to give you the most compatibility. So I would go with that and click on download. So now we're back with the template. If I select it from the list, you guys should have that now as well. We click on next. And it's going to ask for your storage. Now here's something that's really cool. You don't need much. I mean, if you're not planning to do too much at first, you're just running some Docker containers, which is what we're going to show you. You probably don't need that much storage. I would recommend enough for your Docker image and maybe some app data, depending on how much you may be using. If you're already using Docker somewhere, a good way to go about it is to check how much space is actually already being used by your Docker image and by your containers. And that way, that'll give you a rough idea on how much you might need. But let's say in our case, we're going to go with 8 just for the purpose of this video. But that's going to be completely up to you. Go ahead and click next. Select our cores. We can give it 4 cores. Memory, don't need much, but I'll give it 4096. And then we have the ability to set our IP address. So let's say we want to set IP 1.34.
And on this step, it does have the option for DHCP up there, but it's not checked by default. So I highly recommend setting a static address. Because
Correct.
when you're doing things where it's servers and you want to be able to access them, you don't want suddenly that your DHCP gets wiped and it gets a new address, and now you're trying to reach things that you have proxied and they're not going to the right place. So definitely set a static address. If you have the power and the capability to do that, you should do that.
Definitely. A lot of people recommend also you can do it on the router level. I honestly like doing it on the machine level. I just know that way it's always got its own address. Depends how you want to work it. But don't forget to put the CIDR on the end here, which is /24 for this subnet. Mm-hmm. We're going with 134 as our IP address. You don't have to check anything else. I did untick the firewall. I don't even have the firewall enabled at the moment, but just something to be wary of. If you're not ready for it to be on yet, you can uncheck that. If you're happy with the rest of it, now our default bridge is VMBR0. If you did create any other sort of bridge by now, for whatever reason, make sure you pick the right one. We'll go to next, and we can leave all this the same to use the host settings. If you have a DNS you want to put in, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, you can just leave it and it will use the one from the host. Go ahead and click next, and you can start it after you create it if you like. I'll just show you some other settings before we do. Click finish. If you didn't know as well, any of these windows that open up in Proxmox, you can just close those and it will still be running. You'll notice that here in the activity log. You can open it back up again. So don't worry if you close it, it is actually still running. Over here is our container, test LXC. We'll just go to options real quick. And there is a couple of options here you might want to know about. The first thing, and this applies, some of them do apply to virtual machines as well. Do we want it to start on boot? We can say yes.
Yep.
What order
That's
do
one
we
of the
want?
most important ones for sure.
Absolutely, yeah. You'll be caught out with that without that one. The next one is a startup shutdown order. You can set up a shutdown order. I want it to start up first, for example. The startup delay, that basically means after it starts, how long do you want it to wait before it executes the next one in the order? So I can say 30 seconds.
Yeah, and you want to talk about confusing. The first time I saw that option, I was thinking, how long should this one wait before it starts? And yeah, I had to go look at their documentation. I was like, oh, okay, it's completely back from what I thought.
Yeah, I don't know. Some of the terminology is a bit...
Yeah.
I really need someone that in there, I think, to work on some of the terminology. But anyway, the other two options I wanted to show you is the unprivileged container. So this is what we set earlier, and we've already said no, so it won't let us change that right here. But we can actually select other features. If we click on edit, we can allow nesting, we can allow NFS, SMB, and fuse. Now by default, none of those are enabled, so they won't work. Depending on your purpose, if you wanted to map an SMB share like we did with our TrueNAS setup or anything like that, then you want to make sure that's enabled. Also NFS and nesting. I'm going to enable those options, and we're pretty much ready to start it up. If we just go ahead and start it, and we open the console, how's that? It's already up and running.
Up. Was up before you could open the console. That's pretty impressive.
It's amazing. So if I just log into that real quick, you can see from this point on, it feels like any other Ubuntu server. There's nothing that would really throw you off or anything like that. If we weren't running a privileged container, you might notice some differences and you might have some particular issues. There are some settings as well that are done via the command line if you needed to change them. So, you know, things like passing through certain hardware. But in our case, we don't really need to worry about that. That's more if we're running like a Plex server or something. But so for now, that's fine. If I was to reboot it, and I just open up the console again, it's already back up. So you guys can see the benefit of having a container. It's just amazing. It's so fast and lightweight as well. We go to the summary. It's basically using nothing to start up. 30 megabytes of RAM. Now, Brian, do you want to walk us through a virtual machine real quick?
30 megabytes of RAM. Oh, that's insane. Yeah.
Isn't it?
Oh my gosh. So yeah, if you're running Proxmox on a system that doesn't have a lot of resources to start with, you know, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes of RAM, LXC containers are going to be your best friend from a VM standpoint. If you can figure out how to do it in LXC, that's going to be your best bet. Because like we started with VMs of full Ubuntu, they're going to take at least a gig, 2 gigs of RAM to just sit there running and sit idle. And the other thing is a full VM, when you give it resources, it takes those resources right then. So if you say this VM, this Ubuntu VM, a full VM, I'm going to give it 8 gigs. It's going to take those 8 gigs and it's going to like set those aside. Like nothing else can use those 8 gigs while that VM is running.
Yeah.
Even if it's not using them, it's reserved. Whereas the LXC container just says, this is all I need to be running right now, so that's all I'm going to take. And it can go up to 4 gigs if it needs it. So it's a nice differentiator there that really can make a difference. Now, that said, LXC is not perfect for everything. So you may have to kind of work with it to see what you can get it to do in certain situations. Like we've said, the options that you select will depend on what kind of limitations you might hit. But you can do a lot. There is a lot you can do with these things. So definitely, if you have a low resource system, this is a good way to go.
It's pretty phenomenal. I think honestly, it's probably the way to go forward for us as well. I've been using it a lot. As you can see, I have 3 running right now and slowly moving away from that VM infrastructure, but we'll get there. But speaking of VMs, let's get into VMs real quick. I'll show you how to start up a virtual machine, and that way you guys have both options. And you can basically be on whatever level you want for the next stage in our series when we start working with Docker and containers. So let's quickly show you a virtual machine. Similar to our LXC container up the top, or you can right click the node and create a VM. First, we want to make sure we have an ISO. So why don't we go to I have an ISO storage here. This is where all my ISOs are. Yours might be on your local by default, so it doesn't matter where it is, put it wherever you need. Now, the coolest thing I found about Proxmox is we can download an ISO directly from the source if we have the URL. That's one of my favorite things to do. So if I bring over Ubuntu server here, I've just gone to the Ubuntu website. You can see it lets us download it. If we click on download, it's going to pop up and ask us to download it directly to our computer. But if we actually just right-click this, copy the link, and we come back to Proxmox, we'll click on download from URL, paste that URL in there, obviously making sure the URL actually leads us to the ISO. We query it, it will pull it through, check whatever you want, and click on download.
Yeah, they added this in this most recent major version, actually. Before this, you had to download it to your local machine and then upload it through the web UI to Proxmox. So this was definitely one of the best ads. I think this was one of the ones that most people were excited about because they're like, finally, I don't have to do this two-step process to get these ISOs over here. So yeah, it's been great.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Now I've already got it on here, so I just stopped it, but you guys would just let it finish, and there you go. You would have the ISO there ready to go. Just cuts down having to put it on your server and then put it on that server and just have that extra bit of wait time. Let the server do all the work, and you can basically leave it. It's headless, so we can just leave it to download the ISO if you have a slow internet connection, which is really cool. So we've got the ISO. Let's click on Create VM real quick. We'll say 651 is our VM ID. Remember, these need to be unique. And another little tip is if you've removed the VM or the container, it's probably best not to reuse the same VM ID. I really wish Proxmox would actually indicate to you that you've used this before. Because what could happen is, at least in my case, Brian, was I reused the VM ID, and then I started to notice some really weird stuff, like backups from the old machine were starting to show up. Certain jobs from the old machine were starting to show up. It was kind of, it just,
Really?
yeah, it kind of drops into the same spot. At least I found. Maybe I'm doing something wrong here. So I don't know. I just like to pick a new ID every time if it's a new machine.
I haven't seen that, but it's interesting to know that you've seen that because I definitely have reused IDs in the past, and if that's a bad thing, I can stop because there's a lot of numbers you can use for an ID. So I mean, I don't have to keep reusing the same numbers over and over.
Could just be a local thing. I don't know, but in my scenario, I just find it easier to just go with a brand newie. Again, you've got your startup and shutdown order. This time it's actually in the wizard for VM, so you can set all that if you like. We'll go to next. It's going to ask for our ISO, and just pick the storage location and the image. So after you've picked the ISO, go ahead to system. You can pick any graphics cards or anything like that. I wouldn't recommend enabling the QEMU agent until you actually install the agent on the machine. Otherwise, it will stop a lot of the functions that Proxmox tries to issue commands and won't work. So just leave that off until you've actually done that. And we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Something that a few people have asked me, I'll just touch on it real quick. If you're running Windows 11, one of the most important features that you can enable is the TPM module, which is here. In our case, obviously, we're not using Windows, so we're not going to enable that, but that's something that's required by Windows 11. So I just saw some people comment saying they were stuck before, so just an important one. So let's click next. Here's where you create your disk. Now, my scenario, again, I don't really want to create a big disk, especially on local. I can create it on the TrueNAS share, but we're just going to leave this so you guys can compare it to your setup. Do we want it included in a backup job? Bunch of other stuff. That's because I've got advanced checked, just something to note. But I'll leave it on 8 gig and we'll click next. We'll give it 4 cores. Click next. And again, 4096 RAM. I'll uncheck ballooning device, but you have that option if you want to. Do you want to explain ballooning device real quick, Brian?
Basically, you can have kind of a min memory set, and I guess you'd think of it as like, this is what you can use up to, but if it suddenly becomes where the system needs it, it can balloon up to a larger size setting, and then kind of, so it expands up as it needs it and then comes right back down, and really generally just, doing normal tasks is gonna kind of see that first setting as your max, but then you can balloon if you need to for, I guess, intensive tasks that are kind of boom. That's the way that I understand it, at least.
Let it ramp up if it needs it.
It's really not something where it runs there all the time. What it is it says, I'm going to allocate this 4096, but you've told me if I need it, I can go grab basically 12 gigs or whatever you want to set that at, right?
Yeah.
But generally, I'm seriously going to set aside this 4096. You're not going to have access to it.
Yeah.
And then if I need it, I'll go grab some more. So that's basically what it is.
Cool feature if you guys think you might need that. Like Brian was saying, especially with Windows, if you've got the compatibility, it's pretty handy to have. We'll click next, and here's our network section. Now, something we didn't touch on yet, Brian, was networking. And I think, guys, we're going with the assumption you have a very basic network at the moment. We're not looking at firewalls or anything in this particular setup. However, in the future videos for this series, we will cover some advanced networking because we might want to get some pfSense going. We might want to have some more advanced firewalls. We want to have some more virtualized networks. How do we go about doing that? So just for this purpose of today's video specifically, we're just assuming it's just the basics at the moment. We're not looking even at port forwarding because that, again, is another subject. We'll bundle in together, I think, with a networking topic maybe next week.
We're trying to give them the basics of get your Proxmox set up, and then we can tackle some of the more advanced networking stuff afterwards. It's all in the UI.
That's right.
So there's nothing really special that we have.
We'll go ahead and click next. And check all the settings. If you're happy with them, you can pretty much start it off and fire it away. So I'm going to start that. And while it's starting, I'll just quickly run you through some of the options that a VM would give you as opposed to LXC. So if we go to hardware, you can see all the different hardware options we've already selected just then. So if you needed to make a change, if you wanted to add another disk, you can add another disk. If you wanted to add a USB device or pass through another device like a graphics card or even your built-in Intel, you can do that. So if we go to device, here's all the devices currently plugged into my server. You can see we've got our network controllers, so we can, for example, pass through network controllers to something like a pfSense box. We then have our Intel built-in GPU. If you're running a Plex server, that might be something you might want to pass through, for example. Just a couple of things like that. It's all done in the UI, whereas with the LXC container, it's done a little bit differently. So wanted to show you guys that as well. If you go to options, then you have things like your QEMU guest agent. So when we install the agent later, you can come back and enable that. If you have a different boot order, you can change that as well. Just a quick tip for you. If you add or remove a disk, if you add a disk and you want that disk to then be your boot drive, make sure you come into the boot order, edit it, and enable that option. By default, it's disabled. Just if you're wondering why your disk's not booting, I've done that many times. So
the other option you had there was the same one as on the LXC containers, which is, do you want this to start at boot?
Yes.
So don't forget that.
Make sure you enable that, especially if it's going to be your live server. If we've opened up the console, it's going to take you through the usual Ubuntu installation. You can see it's obviously going to take you a lot longer than it was with our container. And that's just the trade-off of using a virtual machine. And go through the installer, follow it through all the way. Again, we can set our specific IP address if you wanted to, which we recommend. So in a virtual machine for Ubuntu, it looks something like this.
Yeah, the wizard, even in the terminal for Ubuntu, is really pretty straightforward as an install. I mean, it's really just go through them and tab space to select options, and then enter for next or okay. I mean, basically, it's really nothing complicated to do. Sometimes it looks a little bit daunting just because it's not the graphical user interface people are used to, but very easy to navigate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's pretty much something that you could have set up, something similar to this, depending on your subnet and whatever your IP is in your range. But that's how it would look. So you would put that subnet in, our address, the gateway, and if you wanted to, any name servers. Otherwise, you can just leave it as is. So let's just say we went with that. We'll go ahead and click save. That'll pull through our IP address, and we click done. Done. We don't have to change any of this unless you had a reason to. Done. Do we want an LVM group? Usually you want that removed in this virtualized setup. So just remove that, but leave the entire disk option selected. Then click on done. Done again. Continue. Put a bunch of information in here. We'll say test LXC. Mind you guys, I'm not going to be keeping this, so all this information I'm putting in is just placeholder. Put in what's relevant to you. Make sure it's accurate. An easy to find name server is important. So don't make it too complicated on yourself. And same goes for the password. Obviously, please make sure that's really secure. Click on done. Definitely would recommend you want the SSH server installed, and that allows us to get to the terminal without having to go through the console in Proxmox. Click on done. Here's a Snap store. We don't want to
just say,
install
like,
anything from
don't-
Snap. Yeah, just
don't install anything from the App Store.
just ignore Snap completely and click on done. And there you go. We basically have a virtual machine now installing and setting itself up. Once it's finished, if you have an SSH client that you like to use, use that to access it. Otherwise, you can always use the console in Proxmox, which is really handy, especially if something goes wrong with SSH. You can still get to the server, basically with a KVM screens up and running for you.
I think that was a good overview. I mean, really, we went through it pretty fast, but I think if they take their time, they go through and kind of pause the video as we're going to do the same things that you've done and really what we've talked about, they're going to have a good starting setup for what they're going to want to use for getting a business going. Now, we're using Proxmox. I think Proxmox is an incredible tool. I think the power that it has, it's a mature product. So I think this was a smart decision on our part. And if I was starting a business and I said I want to use an open source virtualization system, this is definitely the one I would use. There are some other ones out there, like you said, and if they have a preference for one of those, that's great. As long as they know how to navigate in it and do the similar things that we're going to be doing, I say pick the tool that makes you happy and then pick the tool that works best for you. But definitely, if you want to follow along step by step, go out there, get the Proxmox ISO. We'll have links in the descriptions and the show notes, so you can go do that and then burn it to a USB or set it up as a in a TrueNAS system as a virtual machine or kind of however you want to run that thing. That's great, but definitely get it installed. Follow the steps that we've done to get yourself a LXC container set up. Follow the steps that we've done to get yourself a Ubuntu VM set up, and we'll kind of go. So, like I said, next week we'll cover networking. The cool thing about Proxmox is if you have even a single NIC card, you can actually set it up to do some networking with like OpenSense or PSense. But if you have a multi-NIC card in your system, the one that I've got's got 4 ports, and both of my servers have that. So you can set up some of those other open NIC ports to be used with like your OpenSense or your Proxmox, which is really great. You can set them up for VLAN stuff and things like that too. So a lot of power there. So depending on what they have, they may want to go ahead and kind of plan to set that up. But
definitely, there's so many options, and I think if our pace is good, we might be able to get you guys involved with starting off with Docker as well. So yeah, guys, if you also did want to look at supporting Proxmox and what they're doing, if you did have any interest in the enterprise repository like we were talking about earlier, here's the pricing of what they offer. And like I said, look, it's pretty steep, to be honest, 95 euros a year, and it's per CPU socket. So that means, if you've got a server with multiple sockets, that's going to cost you twice as much. If you're just starting off, it's really not essential that you do this. It's not going to give you anything crazy that you might need. And yeah, I would say wait a little bit if you're happy with it down the track. Like we waited 3 years before we decided to go for the enterprise. And we are literally running 3 servers in the cloud, so it makes sense for us. But in your scenario, that may not be the case. But you have the option there at all times if you wanted to go for it. And it also helps them out as well, so it's good all around, isn't it?
yeah, definitely. I'm glad we're covering the pricing of it, because if we're building a business and we say we do want to go with the enterprise, then estimating cost out the door before you start making money is pretty important. So knowing that you can go and get this installed and use it without any cost initially and getting things set up and making sure that it's going to fit your needs and what you want and what we want to do is one of the best things about open source software. But then knowing that I can go and start supporting their business to keep them in business and make sure that I continue to get those updates and those features that make this such a useful system, I think is the most important thing. So definitely knowing that just because it's free doesn't make it bad. I think it's super important to understand that you can also support it to help make it better over time too.
Absolutely, yeah. It's self-serving really at the end of the day. By helping them, we're helping ourselves and we're helping the community in general. So definitely get behind them, guys. If you have the money and you want to support them, by all means, please do. I think from our perspective, for showing you what we've shown you today, I would say you don't need it right off the bat. But please, if you can, help support them and support us as well. So I think we'll leave it at that, Brian. What do you reckon? We'll pick this back up next week and we'll continue with the next part in the series.
Yeah, I'm super excited. Super excited.
Awesome. Well, thanks very much for your time today, guys. Really appreciate you coming to watch. Please remember to like and subscribe to our channels. Both Brian and I have be uploading these on both our channels as we go along with the series. And so it would really, really help us if you like it on both channels if you do like the video. We would really appreciate it.
So if you like the video, subscribe, tell your friends about it so they can come along on the open source journey with us. And we'll talk to you next time.
Thanks guys. Can't wait to see you in the next IBRACORP and awesome open source video.